tonight just because of the lack of time. Okay, so let's start. So we start with 6:28 through 7:7, and that is where Moses and Aaron go before Pharaoh. So I'm going to read. It says, "On the day when the Lord spoke to Moses in the land of Egypt, the Lord said to Moses, 'I am the Lord. Tell Pharaoh, king of Egypt, all that I say to you.' But Moses said to the Lord, 'Behold, I am of uncircumcised lips. How will Pharaoh listen to me?' And the Lord said to Moses, 'See, I have made you like God to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron shall be your prophet. You shall speak all that I command you, and your brother Aaron shall tell Pharaoh to let the people of Israel go out of his land. But I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and though I multiply my signs and wonders in the land of Egypt, Pharaoh will not listen to you. Then I will lay my hand on Egypt and bring my hosts, my people, the children of Israel, out of the land of Egypt by great acts of judgment. The Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand against Egypt and bring out the people of Israel from among them.' Moses and Aaron did so. They did just as the Lord commanded them. Now Moses was 80 years old and Aaron 83 years old when they spoke to Pharaoh." So we have God commanding Moses and Aaron. Moses is, again, I think a few weeks ago we talked about Moses being afraid of his poor speaking ability. And God in his mercy said Aaron will be his mouthpiece. So I feel like that's just, God gave Moses a big job. But he was also very sensitive to where Moses was uncomfortable. And so by giving him his brother to speak, it took some pressure off of Moses. God's laying out his plan. He said, "Let my people go." And then God will harden Pharaoh's heart. God will multiply his signs and wonders in Egypt. Pharaoh will not listen to you. God will lay his hand on Egypt and bring his people out of the land by great acts of judgment. And finally, the Egyptians will know that I am Lord. So what I like is verse 6, where it says, Moses and Aaron did so. They did just as the Lord commanded them. And actually in these chapters, there's 10 specific verses that repeat that exact phrase. And so the obedience of Moses and Aaron is in stark contrast to how we're going to see Pharaoh and his hardness of heart. Moving on to 7:8 through 13 is when Moses and Aaron face Pharaoh. So then the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "When Pharaoh says to you, 'Prove yourselves by working a miracle,' then you shall say to Aaron, 'Take your staff and cast it down before Pharaoh, that it may become a serpent.'" So Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and did just as the Lord commanded. Aaron cast down his staff before Pharaoh and his servants, and it became a serpent. Then Pharaoh summoned the wise men and the sorcerers, and they, the magicians of Egypt, also did the same by their secret arts. For each man cast down his staff, and they became serpents, but Aaron's staff swallowed up their staffs. Still, Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he would not listen to them as the Lord had said. So an interesting fact I got when I was studying was that ancient Egypt, as you all know, they had many, many gods. But one particular god was a snake god called Nihibaku. And the myth behind him was that he swallowed 7 cobras and had power against any form of magic. So I found this really fascinating because Aaron throwing his staff down and having a serpent that ate all the other magical serpents would have had more meaning than it first seems like when I just read it, not knowing that background. But Pharaoh would have known exactly that what God was trying to say there, that he was in charge. And there's also a goddess named Wadjet, and she was the protector of Lower Egypt, the region of Goshen where the Israelites lived. And she was also represented as a snake. So I just love when you get in, you can really see where God's giving us this story and showing us his power, but there's just so many details in it that we can just keep going deeper and deeper. All right. So then, as you also notice, that the sorcerers were able to make the magical staffs become snakes. There's a couple different things where some people say, by people I mean like scholars and, like pastors and all them, that they were like, it was a sleight of hand, or it couldn't have been a real snake. And then there's ones that say it was occultic work. And of course, it was a real snakes that they were making, and it wasn't just a trick. I tend to go on that end because I just think there's so many things that we don't know or see that can go on around here. But either way, it's irrelevant because what God wanted done was done. The sorcerer's staffs were destroyed by Aaron. And, so then, I already did that, sorry. All right, so we get through that. Now the plagues. This is the whole rest of 7 through 10 is all the plagues. And so as the plagues begin, I just wanted to note, as harsh as a plague is, God knows that it is much harsher to spend eternity separated from him. God spoke to Pharaoh through the plagues and all of Egypt in a way they would understand. He attacked their false gods and used their objects of worship to point them to the salvation of Israel. And a lot of times I would read this and think like, God was so mean to Pharaoh in Egypt. And he was just in his punishment of them, but he could have been so much worse, and he could have not even spoken to them in a language they had a chance of understanding. By punishing them in the plagues the way he did, there were so many chances for repentance because they absolutely knew what each plague stood for. They weren't like, oh my gosh, frogs everywhere. Like, what the heck? They knew that those frogs were there for a reason, and it was an affront to the true God that they had the fake gods. So in a way, I see it as patient and loving of God, the way he went about his plagues, because he did want Egypt to turn. But God is God. He knows how it was going to end, and he knew Pharaoh would never change his heart. But that doesn't mean that God didn't want him to, or that would have been his plan. So God used the plagues he used the plagues to teach his chosen people about himself. So in verse 10, 1 and 2, it says, "Go into Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the heart of his servants, that I may show these signs of mine among them, and that you may tell in the hearing of your son and of your grandson how I have dealt harshly with the Egyptians and what signs I have done among them, that you may know I am the Lord." So God is loving, but he knows the end game, and he knew Pharaoh wasn't going to budge. So let's jump into 9 of our plagues. Okay. I already talked about the underlining, so I don't need to talk about that again. All right, so we're going to start with the first plague. The Nile turns to blood. That's 7:14 through 25. So I think Carly mentioned back that they were did you mention that they were in triplicates when you talked about Exodus in the opening? No, she didn't. Okay, I've just read it so much that it's like in my brain. Okay, so they're set in groups of 3. So you have plague 1, 4, and 7. And all those plagues, it's the blood, the flies, and the hail. They all begin saying, "Go to Pharaoh in the morning." So it's very clear that Moses is supposed to get up, get Pharaoh when he's fresh, well slept, rested, and tell him what God has to say to him. Then we have plagues 2, 5, and 8. And on those plagues, which is the frogs, the Egyptian livestock dying, and the locusts, it just says, "Go to Pharaoh." We don't know the time of day. We don't know what Pharaoh was doing, but we know that he said to go to Pharaoh. And then on the plagues 3, 6, and 9, that's the plague of gnats, the plague of the boils, and the plague of darkness. There's no warning. There's no interaction with Pharaoh before these plagues start. They are just started. Okay, so blood. There's a little interesting stuff with the Egyptian gods and the plagues. So some of the gods had character traits, or they were associated with different parts of Egypt. Hapi was the god of the Nile. So turning everything to blood, all the water, the lifeblood of Egypt, that would have been an offense to the Nile god. And also one of their main gods, Osiris, who I actually remember learning about in history, but the Nile was his bloodstream. So God went right for the jugular, the first one, and he turned it to blood, all of it, off of the Nile. If it was in a jar, if it was a puddle away, it was all gone. And the priests, the sorcerers, they were able to copy this plague, which I don't know why they would want to make more blood, but they could do it. And they couldn't end it though. So they could just keep adding to the plague, but they couldn't stop it. And then we move on to the frogs. This is the goddess Heket, the goddess of fertility, and she had a frog head. This could be pointing to Pharaoh murdering the baby boys. The fertility of God's people, the Hebrews, was not going to be stopped. The Egyptian god, their fertility god, is useless. He just inundated them with their god of fertility to the point they were sick of it because it was a useless god. And punishment for Pharaoh slaughtering the Hebrew baby boys, that was one of the points one of the pastors made, which I thought made the most sense. The priests also copied this plague. Again, I don't know why they would want more frogs, but they couldn't end it. They could only make frogs. And then we go on to the plague of the gnats. So this god was called Set, the god of the desert storms. I think some writings call him Seth, but I just settled on Set. That seemed to be the one that came up more. The priests, this would have been an extremely horrible plague for the priests who were thus far copying and keeping up with Moses and Aaron. They were extremely clean and hygienic. So as a rule, they shaved all their hair off their bodies, even their eyebrows, to avoid parasites, and this was so they could be clean before serving their gods. So when the gnats came, they were rendered absolutely helpless. They couldn't worship, they couldn't go to their gods because they would have been tainted. And in verse 8:19, they say, "This is the finger of God." And I think that's absolutely tied to the fact that they were no longer even able to approach their false gods because they were covered in parasites. So that's our first triplicate that's done. So I feel like we've gotten through that. Pharaoh didn't listen the first round. God's like, all right, let's do this again. He's like, here we go though. I'm leaving Israel out. So in verse 8:22, God says, "I will set apart the land of Goshen." And in 8:23, "I will put a division between your people and my people." So from plague 4 on, the Israelites are not affected. They are protected. And it's very clear to Pharaoh in all of these that the Israelites are thriving while Egypt is dying. So we have the plague of the flies. Moses went to Pharaoh in the morning. The god represented here is Khepri, the god of creation, and he had a head of a fly. And in ancient Egypt, flies represented unwavering Egyptian determination. So God swarmed them with their very own flies. Then they were so determined to be hard-hearted against God, so he gave them all the determination they wanted. And it's, to me, the irony and them not stopping their behavior, or Pharaoh not completely complying after all these obvious plagues, especially the flies and the gnats. It just shows me how our heart can be hard to what we want to do. And then 5, the Egyptian livestock die. So this was one where Moses just was sent, go to Pharaoh. Hathor, the goddess of love and protection, is the mother of Pharaoh. And Apis was a bull god and a symbol of fertility. So bulls were really important in ancient Egypt. So they had one bull. I don't know how often. Some scholars were saying about a year. Some would say it would last longer. But they would have one Apis bull that represented Pharaoh. And he was selected as a calf and lived in luxury at the temple, possibly with its mother. And when it died, its death brought an elaborate funeral, and it was mummified. And it was like a huge deal. And he would most definitely have been dead in this plague. So not only did their livestock die and their livelihood, but their representation of Pharaoh would have been taken in this. So they had a spiritual loss on top of all the livestock. And then the Egyptians also thought the way Israel treated their livestock, they thought it was crude compared to how they did. And so in verse 9:7, Pharaoh's reaction to the livestock dying, he sent, and behold, not one of the livestock of Israel was dead. He had to go check. He couldn't believe it because they revered the cows and the Israelites were backwards. So again, I just love how God is showing that it's not about Pharaoh or how they're doing it right or what. It's God's will, and God's protecting his people. And then we go to 6, the boils. This was one of the plagues with no warning. And we have Isis, the healing goddess, and another goddess named Sekhmet, which is a goddess with power over disease. So the plague came from ashes from the kilns. And one of the scholars said, perhaps representing judgment on Pharaoh's crippling labor on Israel making bricks in the kiln. He crippled Egypt with boils from soot from the kiln that Moses threw up into the air. And then our last set of 3, God extends mercy to Egypt by giving them 3 more warning plagues before the final 10th plague, which we'll talk about in a few weeks. So we have hail, which Moses went in the morning to Pharaoh to tell him it was coming. This represented Nut, the sky goddess, and again, Osiris, goddess of crops and fertility. The people in Egypt who feared God's judgment by this point did have a chance to take their animals and their slaves inside. And again, God's mercy, even in his judgment, he gave the people warning. The people that didn't care and still scoffed at the Lord of the Egyptians, their animals, their slaves, they all were killed with the hail and the fire. And anything left was about to die. The fire and the stone coming from heaven, it would have been utter and complete chaos. And we still have no repentance here. The people are still not let go. Then we move on to the locusts. And this is the god Set, god of storms and disorder. He was back on one of the other plagues too. So anything left from the hail, any unsprouted crops, they were now gone. This plague tells Moses why in this plague, God tells Moses why he's doing this. He says, I wonder if Moses was asking God why there was so much pain and death, and why I believe Moses would have had to have some affection for the Egyptian people because he was part of them for so long, and his whole childhood was there. And God lovingly explained why, which I had mentioned earlier. It was about telling the future Hebrews about how powerful God is and how he rescued them and the signs that he's done among the Egyptians to let them know that he is the Lord. But I just love another little bit of mercy, like a hug to Moses, where he explained to him his reasoning, because there's many times in the Bible where God doesn't explain. And I love his gentleness. He's having Moses do a really hard job, but all along the way, he's right there with him. And then we go into 9, the ninth plague, almost the last one. No warning, and it's Ra. The god represented here would be the sun god. God is the true source of light, and the people rejected God, so they rejected his goodness. And their sun god was useless. So they sat in the dark while the Israelites were in the light. I really encourage you guys to read through these this week. Take your time. They're really interesting, the details in here. But I couldn't read all this to us tonight, or we would never leave. Other mentions of plagues in the Bible, which I found interesting. This isn't a comprehensive list, just some of them. But in Numbers 11, there was a plague of quail because the Israelites were complaining about their food. Numbers 16, there was a plague that God used to stop a rebellion. In Numbers 26, people were worshiping Baal, and there was a plague sent. And 2 Samuel 24, David's sin is punished by a pestilence plague that kills 70,000 men. And then the book of Revelation is full of future plagues and judgment upon humanity. So a lot of this stuff today was like a real downer, but I just wanted to compare really quick, talk about Pharaoh's hard heart with David, a man after God's own heart. And both men sinned, both were great leaders, but they both handled things totally different. David turned to God, and Pharaoh turned away. There's 14 verses in these passages that speak about Pharaoh hardening his heart or God hardening his heart. And then we have David, and he wrote this beautiful psalm. God, hear my cry. Pay attention to my prayer. I call to you from the ends of the earth when my heart is without strength. Lead me to a rock that is high above me, for you have been a refuge for me, a strong tower in the face of the enemy. And the contrast blows me away, because anybody that's really read into the life of David knows he was far from perfect. He had plenty of mistakes and actually did some pretty bad stuff, but his heart wanted to serve the Lord, and he went to the Lord for forgiveness and healing. And Pharaoh could only look to Pharaoh and himself, and he ended up just with nothing. Everything's destroyed. He lost everything. And my prayer and my hope for all of us is that when we're dealing with our own hardness of heart, is that we would have hearts like David that want to cry out to the Lord and say, you know what, I don't need 9, 10 plagues to turn away from my sin. I mean, sometimes I do, and that's unfortunate for everybody around me. But I don't want that for us, and God doesn't want that for us. And this is like a love story written from God about how we don't have to go through the plagues, and if we are in a plague from somebody else's stuff, or like we are even like a bad political climate or a bad like health problems or just all those, like we're not alone. God is with us. And when our heart is stony like Pharaoh's, we're on the other side of the cross. Christ died for us. We're redeemed. And there's absolutely no reason that we have to live with that hardness and that anger. A lot of people choose to, but again, it's completely unnecessary, especially knowing that Christ already paid the price for that. And one of my favorite passages, I want to read it to you, Ezekiel 36, 26 through 27. And I will give you a new heart and a new spirit I will put within you, and I will remove the heart of stone from your flesh and give you a heart of flesh. And I will put my spirit within you and cause you to walk in my statutes and be careful to obey my rules. Again, anytime you're struggling, don't be a Pharaoh. Just turn to the Lord. And when we don't understand why it's going on, all Pharaoh had to do was cry out to God and repent and just to be like, Lord, save me. And he didn't. And unfortunately, that's the path a lot of people take. And so take note that all this destruction that came upon Pharaoh and the Egyptians was not necessary. But he did bring it on himself. And when it talks about God hardening his heart, and it wasn't God being mean, it wasn't God saying, well, I picked you to not like you, so I'm going to harden your heart. God knew this man inside and out from birth to death. He knew all his decisions, all his thoughts. And so God knew these things would harden him more. But sometimes it's hard. Sometimes it's hard, like for me to think, oh, why would he pick Pharaoh? Why would he do that to him? Like, isn't that very not nice? But it's truly not. And let me put this. If you're struggling with doubting about any of the like things that God does during these plagues, go to God with them. That's what I did. Because sometimes things just don't make sense. It's like, why would you destroy all these people and why do you do that? Just ask the Lord to show you and to talk to you and to let you know, and he will. Okay, but enough about me. That's it for today. I thank you guys for listening. And if you guys have any questions about where I got any of my information or anything, websites, come ask me. I'm happy to share. So, thanks. Oh, so much information.